Yeah, about now. Welcome back to Philosophy Roulette number 193, where we read and review philosophy. And had just done this modal argument improved right here. And since we were looking at the analysis page, we might as well go down a little bit. And I was looking at this. I was like, philosophical proofs against common sense. I always like common sense philosophy, so let's see what it is. And I know it was here, so this is what we're going to do for the second paper of the day. Philosophical proofs against common sense. By Bryan Francis. Looks like a guy for Bryan Francis. So, I wonder if I should update the title. You know, I'm going to do that for once. Try something new. So, what was it called? Tags, just chatting? No, it's title, not game. See if this works. I'll find out. Okay, and then we will also, if you want the paper, here you go. It's in the chat so you can get to this page very quickly if you guys want. You can always type exclamation point paper in the chat box and the link will pop back up. So, here we go. Let's download said paper. Save, okay. Oops, wrong one. Cool. Okay. Philosophical Proofs Against Common Sense by Bryan Francis, forthcoming analysis, and I do not read abstracts. Actually, is this an abstract or is this just a... Yeah, it gotta be. Nope, no abstract. Initial proof. Consider the following C sentences. What are these C sentences? Anyone with less than 1 cent is not rich. If anyone with less than 1 cent is not rich, then anyone with less than 2 cents is not rich. ... If anyone with less than 10 to the 14 minus 1 cents is not rich, then anyone with 10 to the 14 cents is not rich. It's not the case that anyone less than 10 to 14 cents is not rich. Okay. Hello, Sorites. Surely there's a way of interpreting all but the final Sorites C sentences so that one derives from them. Using just modus ponens, anyone with less than 10 to the 14 cents is not rich. The final C is the negation of... Oh god, I'm getting a little light right in my face. I'm going to have to hide down here. You can see my forehead is kind of bright. And there's no shade on that window. The final C sentence is the negation of the very claim. To have modus ponens apply to the C's in the obvious way to make the derivation, we do two things. First, interpret the C's so that they involve the logical form they certainly seem to involve. For instance, all but the first and last C's are material conditionals by design. Second, ensure that anyone is with, in quote, anyone, and is with, and is rich are univocal throughout the C's, so MP, modus ponens, applies in the usual way. In order to preserve univocality, replace or analyze anyone with something like any adult person in Queens, New York in 1999 who is single with no dependents. Similarly, we can pre-specify is with n cents with something involving a particular measure of wealth, or we can quantify over such measures. Sorites' arguments need not turn on terms with obvious context dependencies such as is rich. They can turn on predicates such as is a pumpkin. For instance, we can do a Sorites series on there is a pumpkin by the tree by proceeding through a series of cases that diminish the pumpkin atom by atom, starting from its top, so the sentence starts out true and ends up false. Or we can have the series focus on term by. The neighboring cases in the series differ by having the pumpkin a yoctometer farther. Yoctometer, sorry. That was a very, very small amount farther from the tree. So there's a pumpkin by the tree goes from true, the pumpkin is on the ground touching the tree, to false, the pumpkin is as far as you like. We can even use proper names such as Bertrand Russell. There are other standard ways of getting around context dependency. Okay, so this is the classic Sorites problem of the heap. You start with 1 grain of sand. Is 1 grain of sand a heap? No. Or actually, and then you keep going 2 grains of sand, 3 grains of sand, and eventually you don't have a heap, and then at some point you have a heap. Alright, so like for me, I could say, look, at a certain point, there was 1 ray of light coming from the sun that was getting in my face. Was it too bright? No. And then you just keep adding another photon, and now I'm hiding from the light because it's going to blind me if I go up a little bit. Okay, so good old classical Sorites from the ancient Greek. The term incommonsensical emits multiple readings, one of which relativizes to group and time, so the earth is round is commonsensical for some groups and times, but not others. MP is modus ponens, is truth-preserving, is commonsensical for those who know logic, but not to most other groups. Just truth-preserving in this paper, I make no use of stronger notions as truth-preserving in virtue of logical form. Stipulate that P is commonsensical at a time for a certain large community if and only if virtually everyone in that community at that time who understands P well is strongly disposed to give P a high credence. In this paper, I'm concerned with the common sense amongst contemporary philosophers. Some clarifications are in order. I mean, similar to the saying, the straw that broke the camel's back. Yeah, that's very similar. I mean, of course this is only aimed at contemporary philosophers, analytic philosophers for that matter. I mean, normal people do not use if and only if in this form in the middle of a sentence that has a very specific meaning. No one could even read, most people reading that sentence wouldn't even understand what IFF means. So, in some sense, this is contemporary philosophers isn't even accurate. It's just a subsection of contemporary philosophers. I mean, no normal human writes IFF in a sentence, and there's only a certain subsection of philosophers who do that also. I mean, a bunch of them understand, but not everyone just does that. So, in some sense, you have to. I know who you are, and I know all you people out there. Like, who would actually do this without even flinching? So, I bring this up because it raises an issue for exactly what is commonsensical. If you are talking about a reasonably narrow subsection of the world, the people who use IFF unflinchingly in a sentence, then what is commonsensical to them? Is that really common sense? Who's it common to? Okay, continuing. First, the definition does not count n. There are twice as many positive integers as there are even positive integers, as commonsensical among philosophers. Although n is intuitive if you put your mind in the right frame, it doesn't count as commonsensical for contemporary philosophers, in my sense, because even though we can still feel the intuitive pull of n, the vast majority of us will reject it, since we have heard at least a bit about elementary transfinite number theory. Transfinite number theory. Again, who are we talking about here that even knows any transfinite number theory? Okay, continuing. Second, one doesn't have to be a successful researcher on P in order to understand P well, in the sense I'm using that phrase. For instance, I'm neither a logician nor a philosopher of logic, but I understand MP is truth-preserving well. I've taught logic several times. I once took a class in the philosophy of logic. I've studied a few articles in the field. I sure hope so if you're publishing on it. But yeah. But I mean, that's fair. You can understand a bunch of things well without being experts, but you can understand it well enough. Here is the first premise of my first proof. 1. There exists an interpretation and a group of familiar elementary inference rules of syntactical logic, such that 1. Each so interpreted C is commonsensical, and 2. From just the so interpreted C's, there is a derivation of a pair of contradictory claims using just those rules of inference. Damn, that's my favorite transfinite number theory? Yes, but then again, you were sat around talking with me for like half an hour, or even more than that anyway. So again, you are not like, how common is that? So yeah, I mean, people like that sort of stuff, and people do understand it, but again, you have to have at least some level of mathematical experience, which for basically most everyone everywhere is not necessary. So it's like, it may just be interesting and cool, but it's not what people are going to be using in their day-to-day lives. Okay. I mean, I'll just tell you some stuff about me, because I always find these sort of things weird. Commonsensical, I tend to have completely different intuitions than other people, so what's common to you and what's common to me or me and other philosophers and me versus other people, not always the same thing. It's not always clear. And then again, I am a non-classical logician. What counts as what counts as elementary in terms of rules of inference rules. Again, I tend to have a bunch of problems with like what people think are just okay, because I don't know why people think they're okay. It's just what they were taught, and that's what we learned. And those are all like historically contingent things, and a lot of them I think are just sort of they suffer from historical accidents and mistakes. So just because they're familiar doesn't make them good. So these are sort of issues that I immediately take with this stuff. But again, that's more particular to me than as criticism of this paper. Continuing. Virtually no one will deny that there's an interpretation W of the sororities C's, so that clause 2 holds. One can derive a pair of contradictory claims from using modus ponens. It's the interpretation that went through your mind when you first read the C's and immediately saw how to apply MP to them in the perfectly ordinary way. Hence, if one isn't true, then under that W interpretation, one that allows for the derivation of at least one C is not at least one C is not commonsensical amongst philosophers. That would be clause 1, failing to be satisfied. What on earth is that specific C saying if it's not commonsensical? The first and last C's are obviously commonsensical, no matter how one interprets them. Thus, if one of the C's isn't commonsensical under W, it has to be one of the middle C's that fails to be commonsensical. But we know perfectly well that under W, each of the middle C's has nothing. Of the middle C's has the following form: if anyone with less than n cents is not rich, then anyone with less than n plus 1 cent is not rich. Alright, so this is a comment right here. This is an inductive argument here. Like if you're doing n and then you're going n plus 1, and it's an inductive argument over the property here, which of course they specified very clearly could not be is rich. And then we've got induction over here. So because it's n plus 1. So we've got inductions over concepts. And this is how the sort of the sororities works. And why? What's going wrong here? And so you're saying if you assume that the first and last are commonsensical points, then you've got this inductive step that somehow is going wrong, where you've got, because they're all of the same form, it's all the same sort of inductive step over and over. And so if they're all of this form, where does it possibly go wrong? Anyone competent in elementary logic can see, since each middle C is a material conditional with universal generalizations as antecedents and consequents by design, in order for it to be false, everyone with up to n cents has to be not rich, but someone with n cents to just under n plus 1 cents is rich. And anyone who knows about the large number of people in the world and their extreme spread in wealth knows that if a middle C is false, then there are two people who differ by only a few cents, and yet one of them is rich. Or take a term such as pumpkin. If a middle C is false, then there are two pumpkinish things that differ in just a few atoms on their respective tops, but only one of them is a pumpkin. A third example. The restaurant is a short walk from here. Goes from true to false in the space of a yoctometer. Those are clearly against common sense for philosophers. The vast majority of us believe that their negations when asked to evaluate. The vast majority of us will believe their negations when asked to evaluate them. Again, one of the middle C's might be false, but that doesn't prevent it from being commonsensical. It's a sociological fact that the Sorites C's are commonsensical amongst philosophers who understand them well. Yes, I agree with this statement that it is a sociological fact among philosophers who understand them well. That, again, does not make it good. Just because the philosophers agree doesn't make it commonsensical at all. It just means that this is how philosophers are. Maybe they self-select for the type of people who actually believe this sort of thing. That philosophers self-select for people who think Sorites in the middle areas are not problematic might be because they're the sort of crazy people who worry about Sorites, and they already thought that to begin with. It's not so crazy to think that philosophers self-select. Again, not against, this is still a well-reasoned argument, but it's just sort of, I laugh at philosophers in general. Like, I'm already grumpy with them today, and it's like, yeah, we self-select. So people, like academia self-selects it. It's true. Now, logicians who worry about the Sorites self-select. So it's sort of a thing. All right, continuing. If all the Sorites C's are true under an interpretation W, then there is a derivation from them of a pair of contradictory claims using modus ponens alone, but modus ponens isn't truth-preserving when applied to the W-interpreted C's. Then modus ponens is truth-preserving when applied to the W-interpreted C's is both untrue and yet commonsensical. The first conjunct of the consequent is a trivial logical consequence of the antecedent plus an obviously true sentence of the scheme. If not P, then P isn't true. The other conjunct of the consequent is entailed by the utterly bland claim that MP is truth-preserving when applied to the W-interpreted C's is commonsensical amongst philosophers. Premise 2 is a generalization of this idea. Okay, so, yeah, I mean, most people accept some form of modus ponens, even if it's not modus ponens, but you get some sort of if-then statement. It is sort of a... Yeah, exactly what form of modus ponens are we talking about here? Like I said, I deal with a little bit of logic, and the idea is that, I mean, if you're going back to Aristotelian times, you've got the syllogisms. That's not exactly modus ponens, that's a syllogistic version of it, but I mean, it's like there are historically different ones, and so things like this, it starts to add up, and then keeps going. All right, 2. Let's continue. For any interpretation W and a group of familiar elementary inference rules are of sentential logic, if 1 and 2 from 1 are true of W are the C... I don't know what this is. What is the W interpreted rules and the C's, but at least one of the rules is not truth-preserving applied to the W's interpreted C's, then each of the rules is truth-preserving when applied to the W interpreted C's is not true but commonsensical. So it's like each of the middle steps is true, with the rule preserving, but it's not true, but it's commonsensical because it seems right at that point. Premise 3 is like 2 in being entailed by a bland thought. Negations of contradictions are commonsensical. I mean, if it's contradictory and negated, that just makes it always true. So it should just be a... now I'm completely losing it. I can see the book Tractatus Logico Philosophus in my head, but I can't get the word for the trivially true logical statement out of my mind, out of my mouth. Help me out, chat, if you can think of tautology before I do. All right. 3. For any interpretation W and a group of familiar elementary inference rules are of sentential logic, if 1 and 2 from 1 are true in the world in the interpretation for the rules and the C's, then each rule R is truth-preserving when applied to W-interpreted C's, and the W-interpreted C's are true. Then, since the derivation of a pair of contradictory claims has all true premises and uses nothing but the rules that are truth-preserving when applied to the W-interpreted C's, the negation of a contradiction isn't true but commonsensical. Can't say I know many Tautologies? Tortulicans. Sorry. Yeah. Well, just find yourself your favorite contradiction and then you negate that, and then you'll know a tautology. It's always true. Okay. 4 is a logical. So basically, if you have something that's a negation of contradiction isn't true because it was a Sorites, and that's false. So you're negating something that's false. No, the negation of a contradiction isn't true, but commonsensical. But it's not, because you're already starting off with it false, and then you're negating that. But you were considering the thing that wasn't true false, and then you've negated it, and now it's back to being commonsensical, but not true. Not true. We're getting a few iterations here. That's a little bit hard to say. 4 is a logical truth, but helpful to make explicit. For any interpretation W and a group of familiar elementary inference rules R of sentential logic, if 1 and 2 from 1 are true of interpretation rules and the C's, which entails that each W interpreted C is commonsensical, each R or each rule is truth-preserving when applied to the W interpreted C's, and at least one of the W interpreted C's isn't true, then at least one of the W interpreted C's isn't true but commonsensical. 5 is an obvious logical consequence of 1 through 4, and 6 is an obvious logical consequence of 5. Hence, by 1 to 4, there exists an interpretation W in a group of familiar elementary inference rules R of sentential logic, such that either A, each R is truth-preserving when applied to the W interpreted C's, isn't true but commonsensical. This is from 2. B, and a negated contradiction isn't true but commonsensical. This is from 3, or C, at least one of the W interpreted C's isn't true but commonsensical. This is from 4. Hence, by 5, some claim either A, B, or C in 5 isn't true but commonsensical. Okay, so this is basically outlining the different parts of a Sorites. Either it's the rules, that's the R, it's the result, it's the negated contradiction is wrong, or it's one of the initial setups, the W interpreted C's, is mistakenly wrong somehow. So you've either got the setup in the W's, in the C's, you've got the rules, or you've got the conclusion. I mean, that's basically what you're doing, is you're going through the different parts of the Sorites. You break it down to 3 parts, and one of them has to be wrong because there aren't any other parts. All right, 1, 2, 6 is a non-formal philosophical proof of the proposition a commonsensical claim isn't true. Any one of them. The C's are commonsensical. But when you start putting them together, is the combination of a bunch of commonsensical claims also true? I'm not so sure, actually. Because any one of them we accept. Because I accept that if you have 1 penny, you're not rich. But when you start grouping this stuff together, I'm not so sure that that's the case. And you can see in this, you've got each R is truth-preserving when applied to a W interpreted C is true but commonsensical. But see, you're quantifying over all of them. So even though you're talking about each one specifically, this statement A is grouping all these R's individually together. All right, and so the negated contradiction isn't true but commonsensical. But you see, if you have A thrown in there, you're grouping that. And same here, at least one of these things isn't true but commonsensical. So either both A and C are talking about groups of things. And so I'm not so sure that once you start grouping things together, you've done something commonsensical. Because people generally, when they do stuff like this, they have set the problem up the way they wanted. And so they're being very clever. And they're making it sound very commonsensical, but I don't know if it is. This is one of my worries about these things, because some claim from either one of these, well, what exactly is the claim here? Isn't true but commonsensical. But what is the commonsensical thing that we called commonsensical? And is there some sort of quantifying grouping of these things that might not be so commonsensical? Because we're grouping maybe perhaps millions of inferences together, and you're saying, well, each of them in each step is reasonable, but maybe the quantification over 1 billion steps isn't so commonsensical. I mean, it isn't. Who actually takes 1 billion steps? It's not possible to take 1 billion steps. You can only take a few steps. All right, continuing. The only way for a philosopher to be aware of 1 to 6 and completely reject it, its conclusion is to reject at least 1 to 4. Yep. But 4 is an obvious logical truth from 2 and 3 are obviously entailed by the obviously true entailment. True claims, negations of contradictions are commonsensical, and it's commonsensical that the derivations, familiar elementary rules of inference for the sorites is just modus ponens, are truth-preserving when they are applied to the W interpret C's. Okay, and this is exactly what I just did. I started saying, no, there's quantifiers built in here, and I don't like the quantifiers. They scare me. So, that's exactly what happened. I started attacking the familiar elementary rules of inference as not so good, as not so clear. Okay, hence the only competent way to reject the sounds of 1 to 6 is to reject the truth of 1. Nope, don't agree. But we saw that 1 is about as certain as any philosophical claim ever gets. Yeah. So this is the thing. If you are once you start looking at more logic, you start saying, I don't like what people just assume is clearly logical. That's one of the things. But we saw 1 is about as certain as any philosophical claim ever gets. I kind of want to go back and look at that now. All right, I'm on page 4. Let's go look at claim 1. How claim is... Where's number 1? Yep, well, the elementary inference rules. Don't buy that. And if you give C's the property of commonsensical, then the so interpret C's the derivation country using just those rules of inference. No. You see, again, depends on how you understand your logic here. But okay. But yeah, again, if you're going to be in the world of this sort of taking the common understanding of logic, yeah, that's fair. This is a very fair argument. I mean, I, again, do not classify myself as your average person just reading this and be like, oh yeah, that's what things are. I'm like, nah, I don't agree with that stuff. Okay. Hence, nonformal philosophy refutes a portion of common sense for approximate Alright. Yeah, and all these people, I'm sure, disagree with these things. Non-formal philosophy refutes a portion of common sense. Yeah. Okay, so if you accept it, then you've got a problem. And that's a problem because philosophy shouldn't be refuting something that should be more certain. If you have to argue for something, but the other stuff is just completely obvious, the stuff that you're arguing for, it's more likely you got that wrong, and so there's a problem with your philosophy. So that's part of the issue here. Now, maybe the world is wrong. Maybe what you thought about the world was wrong, and the philosophy is indicating that, but it's more likely that you were wrong. That's just a historical claim. Okay, section 2. The revenge proof. Suppose that contrary to my argument of section 1, there is an excellent philosophical argument that 1 isn't true. So so the author is sticking with what they think is the most likely thing to change, which is that claim 1 we just went over. So we are now assuming that there is an argument of the form P sub 1 minus Pn, thus 1 isn't true, where the P's are the premises of this amazing argument. Oh, not minus. Premise 1 through Pn, thus 1 isn't true. Where the premises of the P's are the premises of this amazing argument that 1 isn't true. Incredibly, the existence of this premise 1 to premise n, thus 1 isn't true argument will not help avoid my thesis that non-formal philosophy refutes of a portion of common sense. Note first that virtually all philosophers who understand the Sorites paradox believe the following sociological proposition about their own community. Virtually all its members think that there's a way of understanding the C's so that they are commonsensical and collectively inconsistent. Being in the community of philosophers who know the Sorites paradox well, philosophers of language almost always mean knowing a good deal about what others in the community think about the paradox. We are social creatures after all. So philosophers familiar with the paradox overwhelmingly think that virtually everyone familiar with the paradox thinks there's an interpretation of the C's so that they are commonsensical and jointly inconsistent. Again, the sociology of this is maybe this is sociologically true, but I mean, I'm attacking induction here over concepts. I don't think induction over concepts is the same as induction over mathematical things. So induction over non-mathematical concepts is not the same as induction over mathematical concepts. And so this sort of characterization as there's interpretation of the C's is not where I would think. I mean, I agree that there's a way out of the paradox. I just don't think this is the best way to go. So, but yeah, I mean, sociologically, the author's probably right. Okay, continuing. This shows that one is commonsensical relative to the group of people today who understand it well. Why? Why do we think we understand things well? That we just may have spent more time at this, I would go with. Now do an exercise. Let P premise be 1 is commonsensical. Take the hypothesized argument that 1 isn't true, the argument P1 through Pn, thus 1 isn't true, and modify it so it becomes P, comma, P1 through Pn, thus 1 isn't true. Oh, they're just, yeah, this is why it's called revenge. They're going to make this self-reflexive. Okay, P, therefore, P1 minus Pn, thus 1 isn't true, and P. That is, add the just defined P to its premises and make the new conclusion a conjunction of the old conclusion 1 isn't true and P. Clearly, that argument is no worse than the original argument, P1 through Pn, thus 1 isn't true, as we were in effect merely adding P to both the premise and the conclusion. So there's like an addition rule here. You've just added P over here and you add P over here, and so why should this matter? Because you've just got on the left there's a P and on the right, and it's like, so P on the left, thus P on the right. What could possibly go wrong there? Thanks for stopping by, Voracious. I really appreciate it. It's fun to stream. Yeah, and any new people here, please feel free to ask questions. I read philosophy and discuss it, and it's for people to ask questions and try to figure out what's going on. But this is my first time reading it too, so I get things wrong. Okay. Note that the new conclusion 1 isn't true and P obviously entails by existential generalization. Some claim isn't true but commonsensical. And we've got quantifiers. Quantifiers are being brought in. Oh my god, quantifiers. Alright, construct the second new argument P premise 1 through premise n. Thus, some claim isn't true but commonsensical. Obviously, that argument is no worse than the one we started off with, which is premise 1 through premise n, thus 1 isn't true. So you've just added the P on the left and you add the P on the right, and then you generalized away from just the P, just saying there is one, and it happened to be the P earlier, but we'll call this P0, or whatever, the premise 0, and so now we've just got this sort of premise 0 plus all the other premises, thus there's something that's isn't true but commonsensical. And here is the revenge proof that non-formal philosophy refutes a portion of common sense. Okay, so this is now going to create a paradox of this whole thing that we've just set out to begin with. Alright, 1. If premise 1 is true, then since 1 to 6 is clearly valid and philosophical and all other premises are clearly true, there is an excellent philosophical argument that some claim isn't true but commonsensical. 2. If premise 1 isn't true, and then there is an excellent philosophical that premise 1 at premise n, thus 1 isn't true. That is, if 1 isn't true, then isn't true. Then an excellent philosophical argument for that fact. This premise is not at all trivial, but it will be revealed below to be dialectically apt. If 1 isn't true, then there is an excellent philosophical argument to that fact. Okay, that's what should have been said. Let P be 1 is commonsensical. Yeah, so this is premise 0. This 1 is commonsensical. P is true as shown above by reflecting on what philosophers think about each other. What do philosophers think about each other? That's a very good question. Okay, if P is true, there is an excellent philosophical about premise 1 to premise n, thus 1 isn't true. Then there's an excellent philosophical argument, the premise 0, this thing right here, that 1 is commonsensical, premise 1 to premise n, thus some claim isn't true but commonsensical. 5. If there is an excellent philosophical claim, premise 0 and premise 1 to premise n, thus some claim isn't true but commonsensical, then there is an excellent philosophical argument that some claim isn't true but commonsensical. Hence, by all the stuff above, then there is an excellent philosophical argument that some claim isn't true but commonsensical. And then, hence, by 1 and 6, there is an excellent philosophical argument that some commonsensical claim isn't true. Okay. The philosopher who thinks philosophy doesn't refute a portion of common sense has to reject the soundness of 1 to 6. That means claiming 1 isn't true since the rest of the argument is indisputable. I find that dubious, but reasonable given the context. Since she holds that 1 isn't true, she probably thinks there's an excellent philosophical argument against 1. In fact, it's highly likely that she thinks she could tell us in detail about that excellent argument against 1. After all, 1 is highly intuitive, so if she thinks it's not true, she will very probably think she has an excellent argument against it. Hence, she will agree with premise 2. Since by hypothesis she denies 7, she has to deny 3, since the rest of the obviously valid 1 to 7 argument is indisputable. But to deny 3 is to deny a stubborn, empirical, non-normative fact about the views of contemporary philosophers. The fact that the vast majority of philosophers familiar with the Sorites thinks that the C's can have their obvious logical characteristics and still be commonsensical. Obvious logical characteristics. What is an obvious logical characteristic, people? Just because it's old doesn't make it good. Many times it does. But, I mean, you have to critically look at why we think certain things in logic are accepted. Now, the fact that they've lasted so long is a point in their favor. But, to tell you the truth, where was that existential claim where they straight up was like existential generalization is not that old in terms of logic. It ain't. And so why is this one, this line right here, I can point to it and be like, of all the things in this paper, this one is the newest thing. Existential generalization, you can basically pinpoint to Frege in 1870 something? And in terms of logic, that's that's new. Now, I'll grant that it's been very well studied in the last century and a few decades, but it's not in the grand scheme of like logic and philosophy, that's not that old. It's very current. Okay, but yeah, again, my grumpiness about logic notwithstanding, the rest of this is still pretty reasonable, which is why this is a nice paper. 3. Philosophical significance. The proofs need not use the Sorites. Many philosophical problems can be used to generate a set of C claims that have very similar consequences. Making lists of C's for new proofs is a matter of patience. All we need is a set of commonsensical claims that under a commonsensical available interpretation uses commonsensical truth-preserving inference rules to derive the negation of a commonsensical claim. Some proofs will be significantly stronger than others. As one would expect, the liar paradox is similar to the Sorites in that it's perfectly suited to generate extremely strong proofs. In addition, one can use the problem of the many. There is at least one tree in my backyard. Every tree in my backyard is composed of chemical atoms. For all x, if x is a tree in my backyard that is composed of chemical atoms, then there is at least one plurality of chemical atoms that composes it. Some would say, with reason, that there is exactly one such plurality. For all x and y, if x is a plurality of chemical atoms, y is a tree in my backyard, and x composes y, then there exists W and Z, such that W is a plurality of chemical atoms, X and W differ in members, Z is a tree in my backyard, and W composes Z. The two large pluralities, about 10 to the 30 chemical atoms in each, are literally some unbelievably % overlapping and are, to all appearances, equally good candidates for composing a tree. For all x and y, if x and y are pluralities of chemical atoms and x and y differ in members, then there are trees in my backyard T1 and T2 such that x composes T1 and y composes T2. Then T1 is not equal to T2. There is at most one tree in my backyard, but you've got these things that aren't the same. Although these C's are commonsensical, some of them are not as commonsensical as those for the Sorites or liar. Although we might not know which commonsensical claims are refuted, we know that they are in 4 categories, with overlap in borderline cases. Let's see. Alright, let's continue. Let's get through this. Everyday life claims. Some people are rich. There are trees in North America. Elementary logical claims. Modus ponens is truth-preserving. Contradictions aren't true. Philosophical claims. If a tree is composed of atoms, then there's a group of atoms that composes it. It is not the case that anyone less than 65,000 euros is not rich, but someone with less than 65,001 is rich, or some amount of money. If A isn't true, is true, then A isn't true. So it's a liar paradox. These are full and interpretation claims. Some interpretation of the Sorites sees has them commonsensical and functioning as the only premise of a derivation of a contradiction using just familiar elementary inference rules. Yeah, this is putting a lot of weight on different kinds of commonsensicality. I mean, why is everyday life claims commonsensical, and then why are you using them? Because we're not giving just everyday claims. You're using everyday claims, and then you are doing everyday claims with these sorts of arguments which are not everyday things. And that's the same thing with the Sorites. No one does modus ponens a billion times in the everyday life. That's not an everyday thing that they're doing. And so it's like, why do you think everyday claims, when subjected to doing something a billion times, are still the same? But yeah, it's like every step of the way it's okay, but doing it a billion times is not normal. And so everyday life is not the same. Everyday logical claims, again, we don't do modus ponens a billion times. Maybe a computer does. But yeah, it's like even then, computers ain't perfect. So it's like these sort of things, I'm worried about the process of what's everyday, the everyday processes. Okay, continuing. If there is a proof P that there exists a false claim K, that the vast majority of people today who understand K are well enough or strongly disposed to assign a high credence to it, then P is philosophically significant for those people. Sure. Hence we have shown that there are philosophically significant informal philosophical proofs. Sure. To that extent, philosophy achieves real results. So here's where we were going. They just wanted to say that we matter, philosophy achieves real results. Woo! Okay. Some philosophers will think the everyday life category is the most significant one. Perhaps that is the best way to interpret the defense of common sense is more like in Kelly and these other peoples. However, whether it's significant that a common sense claim K is true might depend on whether K is paired with a closely connected truth that does the work that K was supposed to do. For instance, students in metaphysics classes often insist that compositional nihilism, the view that there are no proper parts, is merely superficially counterintuitive. After all, according to the very simple version of nihilism, although there are no trees in North America, since if they existed they would have proper parts. There are a great many tightly knit groups of similar simples arranged tree-wise, and those individual groups are located precisely where and only where common sense says the individual trees are located. Refuting there are trees in North America might not be as significant as commonly thought, despite the fact that it falls into the everyday life category. It depends on 1, whether there are truths paired with falsehoods, and 2, whether the fact of such pairings diminishes the significance of the refutation. Yeah, so again, how we are grouping things together, the pairings, matters here. Since there are many philosophical problems that can generate excellent arguments of the forms 1 to 6 and 1 to 7, depending on Arabic or Roman numerals, there are many false commonsensical claims. Suppose all of them are in the latter 3 categories, and perhaps there is virtually nothing in the first category. The philosophers who think philosophy doesn't refute common sense can be charitably interpreted as claiming that philosophy doesn't refute claims in the everyday life category. On the one hand, if they are right, then claims from everyday life have been spared, but that means we have missed 1, the lack of soundness of the simplest elementary inference rules. Yeah, well, I don't think they're so simple. 2, the falsehood of many standard philosophical claims, such as if a tree is composed of atoms, then there is a group of atoms that compose it. And or 3, the falsehood of empirical platitudes, such as some interpretation of the Sorites sees has them commonsensical and functioning as the sole premise of a derivation of contradiction using just familiar elementary inference rules. Hence, that means most of us are bad at philosophy, since a great many of us endorse those false claims in our work. Flatter yourself as one of the exceptions, then focus on the unwashed masses for the purpose of this paper. That's what I've been doing. In another paper, I examine the epistemic consequences. On the other hand, if many of the false claims are in the first category, then 2 interesting results follow. First, everyday common sense contains many remarkable falsehoods refuted by philosophy. Second, the Morean move made so often in philosophy, when you encounter what you realize to be a philosophical argument that goes radically against everyday common sense, retain your common sense belief, and conclude that philosophical argument is unsound is unreliable. In fact, it's unreliable even if the false claims are in the other categories, since the move is made in philosophical discourse constantly. Yeah, sure. This is a nice paper. It's like, well, look, if you take a lot of these common things in philosophy, then you're going to get some weird results, and that definitely means that either reality is wrong or all of philosophy is wrong. I make the Morean move. It's the philosophers who are wrong. We're always wrong. We're almost always wrong. It's historically the way it is. And so it's like, I just find that funny. It's like, okay. It's like, why would you actually believe the philosophers when we get things... I mean, we've been arguing about this stuff forever. Why would we ever think we're right? I mean, this is just a pessimistic meta-induction on you here, but it's like, wow. It's like, really? Did you actually think that everyone hails the philosophers as getting everything right? It's like, no one does that. We might have very interesting things to say, and we might be right sometimes, but like, oh man. Like... You want to flatter yourself? It's like, okay, and you think you're one of the exceptions, and then you focus on the unwashed masses for the purpose of paper. I'm not focusing on the unwashed masses for the purpose of paper. I'm making fun of the rest of us philosophers who think we're better than everyone else. It's like, no. We tend to be right sometimes, but like, seriously, we still, for every philosopher you think is completely right, there's going to be one that you think that completely disagrees with them that has a very good argument usually. I mean, sorry to go Hegelian on you, but like, this is just sort of like the historical thing. And it's not that there's no fact of the matter, there usually is, but like, the unwashed masses here are the philosophers you're talking about. This is, I think the target of this argument's a little funky right here at the end. But yeah, this is a fun paper anyway, because if you take the standard line of like how things are, then yeah, this paper might actually mean something to you. Because the simple, as they say right here, the simplest elementary inference rules, you think you're using like these grounded elementary inference rules, but even using those seem to get you into trouble. I mean, of course, mixing induction with logic has been trouble since Zeno. Like, Zeno brought up this whole thing where you take a step, you take a half step or whatever, and you never get anywhere. This has always been trouble. And so it's like, why do you think the simplest elementary inference rules are so good when they've been causing problems for 2,000 years? And it's like, okay. It's like, yeah, we haven't solved them yet. But why do you actually think they're so good when we've been using them sometimes, but not other times? I mean, the Sorites is an old problem. This is from the Greek. So yeah, it's just... I like this paper because it's I think this actually exposes a lot of the sort of the arrogance of philosophy. Like, these aren't new problems. This is even like but I don't even think this is a new solution. This is sort of like this problem that's being pointed out here has been an old argument, like Zeno. Okay. I mean, if you want the logical form, you can just go to Lewis Carroll's tortoise and what the tortoise said to Achilles. Sure. But I shouldn't hate on this. This is a pretty nice paper because this sets out the argument very nicely. So basically what they did was they revenge paradoxed a Sorites by making a Sorites over the structure of an argument. So they took the Sorites paradox, made it about the rules of argumentation, and then revenge paradoxed it, so you get yourself a paradox out of the Sorites. So it's not just a contradiction from what are apparently secure premises, but then you've got a paradox here where your reasoning can't really be so secure anymore. So what you thought was secure is not. So that's very, very nicely done for this author. Yeah. Good job. Yeah, so let's see. But I mean, I don't have a whole lot more to say about it. It's like, if you assume the sort of standard picture of this is just like a second level up of the paradox that you're going to... contradiction, and then you've got yourself a paradox here. Okay, if anyone has any questions out there, please let me know, but I'm going to cut out for now. I've been streaming probably for way too long, and I hope everyone has a good day and stays safe out there. Bye-bye.